Specifically about public policy, and our moderator is Juliet Alfred, who is the national environmental writer for the Washington Post. We have Colin Bangs of Coldwell Banker, Steve Durr of A&B Financial in Jackson, Tim Davis of the Montana Smart Growth Coalition, Jeff Harris of the Flathead County Planning Department, and Nick Kaufman of WGM Group. We deliberately in addressing the policy matters, we didn't really go so much to elected public officials, rather to people who are engaged in the policy issues deeply day to day, but are not necessarily running for public office. So with that, I will turn it over to Juliet. Thank you.
Hi there. So I'm going to try to do very little talking during this panel. But I'll just say, to put it in context, I came in from Washington, D.C., and I spent yesterday going around with some wildlife biologists looking at what's happening here in the Missoula area and how it's affecting the landscape around here. And I was talking to a wildlife biologist for the tribe that controls the Flathead Reservation. And his words to me, Dale Becker, were, everybody wants a little chunk of paradise out in the country, and there's a finite number of chunks of paradise here. So I think that what we're going to be exploring is exactly how do you manage it when everyone wants to come to Montana and to the west to get their chunk of paradise in the country. And we'll now just take it away, and everyone's going to outline some of their visions, and then we'll have a discussion and open it up for questions.
We were told to keep this short with our most important parts right up front, and for me, my passion is affordable housing. I firmly believe that every community, every society, every government has a moral responsibility to make sure that there's affordable housing for everybody in their community. Everything from the handicapped people who need housing, need subsidized housing furnished by the nonprofits and the government agencies, to the young couples who are struggling to find enough money to get into their first house, to the retirees who are moving down into the smaller homes. The whole spectrum of the community needs decent, affordable housing. And in my mind, that's one of the biggest failures in most of the Rocky Mountain West over the last 10 years. We see affordability escaping us by leaps and bounds. And the more successful the areas are, the worse the problem is. The more growth there is, the worse the problem is. And the problem I see is that I look around, and I've done a lot of studying of what's being done in different parts of the West and in places like Missoula, and I have yet to find a model that I think will work. I'm not here to give you a solution, I'm here to tell you the problem more than that. The two models that I see the most are what I would classify as the resort model, which is for the resort areas where they basically preserve everything because they understand that what brings people is the beauty around them and the wildlife habitat and the streams and the mountains and the resource and all the beauty that's there. So they basically say don't build anything anywhere except for a few people that have a lot of money. So they build for the 20% we spent too much time talking about today, and they don't build anything for the 80% of the rest of us. And that, in my mind, is a huge problem. There's got to be a limit as to how far you can expect your workers to drive in the morning. I think that any community that the people that serve you during the day can't live here at night is losing something. One of my biggest fears is that Missoula could become a place like that. Bozeman already seems to be going in that direction, and I want to do everything I can to head that off. The other model that I see that I dislike just as much is the sprawl model, where it's build everything everywhere, and they're saving nothing. There's got to be something in between the two that we haven't yet invented, but we have to, and I think we can. In all the discussions here, though, the two things you find that people can agree on is everybody hates sprawl and everybody hates density. Well, given the vote between the two, I'm in favor of the density.
All right, thank you, Colin. Before we can talk about policy changes, we need to talk about the current regulations that are in place pretty much evenly throughout Montana, or the lack of regulations, and the land use patterns that that administration or lack of administration have given to us. And so today we sort of walk through a candy shop of what excellent development would be like if you had an open checkbook and your clients were very, very wealthy. The fact of the matter is, if you've been in Montana for a few decades, let's call it 2 or 3 decades, then I want to talk to you about a land use pattern that's pretty familiar to all of us. So if you drive the highways of Montana, I want you to kind of close your eyes and imagine this scenario. You're driving down the highway and there's a log home manufacturer. And you drive a little further and there's another log home manufacturer and a few 1-acre tracts with mobile homes. We'll call that the first generation of development, sort of stealing from Jonathan this morning. The second generation of development is log home manufacturer, 1-acre tract, 1-acre tract, 5-acre tract, fly fishing guide service, log home manufacturer, right? And then sort of the next generation is log home manufacturer, 1-acre tract, fly fishing shop, super Walmart. And then as the backdrop behind that would be 1- and 5-acre tracts, and then up the hill from that, before you get to the Forest Service land, would be what we call this morning A9 development. How do we get out of that pattern that is so common in western Montana, and to a pattern which is traditional town or community like Hamilton, open space, new community, open space, traditional town like Victor, open space, new community, traditional town like Lolo. And what we need to do is we need to think about the way developers work so we can change our policy. So developers react to cost, time, and risk. Those are the 3 things they react to. So if you go to a county commissioner hearing anywhere in Montana and sit through that hearing, you'll see a 6-pack of 5-lot subdivisions come through, which create 30 lots or 20 lots or 15 lots every week, every week, every week, every week. That results in 700 to 1,000 lots a year of land-extensive development, incremental development spread out across the countryside in Montana. However, if you come to that same county commissioner's hearing and show up after those summary subdivisions and propose a 30-lot or a 40-lot or a 200-lot or a 600-lot subdivision, what you'll find out is suddenly there's a reality in terms of the impact of what 200 lots are. And so what we have is, if Colin decides to bring in a 5-lot summary subdivision 6 miles from town, his only costs are a 24-foot wide road in the subdivision review process. If this gentleman decides to bring in a 125-lot subdivision adjacent to a community, he builds sewer, water, storm drainage, curb gutter and sidewalk, contributes to parkland dedication. But what about risk? If Colin is 6 miles out of town, he has no neighbors. So his risk in terms of the public involvement is significantly reduced. If I move closer to you, an example of higher density, you tend to get uncomfortable, and that's right, and you're liable to come to a public meeting. That increases risk, you see. So what we need to do is very similar to what Stuart talked about in the first session, to change the way we administer our rules and regulations so that we get the land use pattern that we want. Because the way we administer our current regulations, people, we get the land use pattern that those regulations encourage. It reduces cost, time, and risk to land-extensive 1-acre and larger tracts in the state of Montana. And so we need to create policies with incentives and disincentives. So the person who brings in the cluster development, and I'll give you an example. We're working on one right now. You saw one of our developments earlier called Hellgate Meadows, but we're working on one in Ravalli County that's called Aspen Springs. Very controversial. 600 lots, almost 50% open space, will provide housing for the average Montanan who will work in Ravalli County. But it's a different pattern than 5-acre tracts around it, which has made it controversial. And we have been in the process for over 18 months. Meanwhile, the summary subdivisions and the 19-lot subdivisions have just breezed through the process. So from a policy change, we've leveled the playing field and actually create a comparative advantage for the types of development that we want to see. Thank you.
Great. Now Steve's going to give us the perspective from Wyoming and kind of what we can learn from a place that's been dealing with this longer than this area.
All right. Well, I am Steve Dewar, and I'm a lawyer, and I was the director of the Jacksonville Chamber of Commerce for 7 years, so I was right in the vortex of this dispute between commerce and conservation. in a beautiful place where the billionaires truly are pushing out the millionaires. It became exciting and frightening to me in thinking about this conference and living that life for 7 years to realize that the passion and romance for the Old West that's driving the New West is one based on self-reliance, individualism, property rights, water rights, me and mine, and that sort of thing, which Patricia Limerick, the director of the Center for the American West at the University of Colorado, defined in a book called A Legacy of Conquest, the Old West, a legacy of conquest, manifest destiny, extraction. I think the challenge for us is to understand the opportunity and the window of time we have to make sure that the 21st century New West that is attracting the huge amount of wealth from the boom generation becomes the New West, a legacy of investment. So how do you do that? How do we meet that opportunity to make sure that the New West is a legacy of investment? Well, I don't think you do it with more laws, and more regulations, and more meetings and processes where you set up a situation where it's us against them and it's I win, you lose. And we all have experience with master plans and regulations and trying to achieve the vision, but get caught up in 30 meetings where you just grind one another down. So how do we do it? How do we realize the opportunity of the 21st century wealth becoming a legacy of investment in the New West? It's complex but simple. It starts with an individual commitment and then a community commitment to respect the power and the spirit of the places that we live in. And really, the capital that comes with that investment company ought to be easy to get pulled together because our marketing manager for that company is a terrific woman. God is a woman. Look at how she shows off her beauty in all of our communities. If you don't believe that God's a woman, see the Da Vinci Code, understand. So, all kidding aside, the objective proof of this is a place like Teton County where the Grand Teton is the quintessential peak, a caricature of a mountain rising from the flat to the top of the Grand, almost 7,000 feet, protected by conservation, and maybe now exploited. Teton County, because of the beauty of the blessings that God gave it, is the wealthiest county of all 3,140 counties in the United States. Jonathan Schechter has with him the Teton County Extremes from his Sustaining Jackson Hole book. And on many measures that are about money, it's the wealthiest. That's bad because it displaces working folks and community character. That's good because 98% of Teton County is public land and we really can't mess up to 2% too badly, or can we? But the fact of the matter is that there's a whole new wealth that's coming to the New West. It's human capital. It's the people who know how to make money, know how to get things done, and could possibly live in second homes up on a hill where the lights are on and nobody are at home. But at least in Jackson Hole, they're empowered to get involved in our community, and they're investing in our community, and they're providing the social infrastructure that can help us realize the New West, a legacy of investment. So I'm supposed to finish up here on all this in about 2 minutes, but we created something called Sustaining Jackson Hole. It's a process that Jonathan was the quarterback of, but it involves all facets of the community, and we can give you some information about that. One project that came out of that is a project called 1% for the Tetons, based on the concept of 1% for the planet. And then our Chamber of Commerce business leaders had the audacity to come up with a brand for the community that was idealistic. The brand is a promise to respect the power of place. So I think that in terms of public policy and law, we won't realize this investment in the New West through those types of old tools, because where we will realize the opportunity to create the New West is beyond the law, where people meet and listen and care and commit and promise to maintain the distinctiveness of these special places and to embrace the new wealth, the human capital that's coming to our communities, and to promise in our individual lives and communities to respect the specialness and the power of the places God gave us to live in.
Jeff will talk about the unenviable task of sometimes being in charge of doing some of this planning.
Thank you, Julie. My name's Jeff Harris, and I'm Director of the Planning Department in Flathead County. And so when I say that, I look through the lights. A little bit difficult. If I had a PowerPoint presentation, I would entitle it Observations from a Newcomer. I've been here a little bit over a year in the state of Montana, and I'm very glad and proud to make the change. Flathead County, as everyone knows, is experiencing tremendous growth, averaging to over 20% per decade. Comes out to about 2% per year, a little bit over. That's on a countywide level. When you look at it a little bit more closely, you see that most of the physical growth and development is occurring within the cities and not the unincorporated county. And that's primarily because of the public services and infrastructure that's available adjacent to the cities. Looking at it from a planning perspective, from a planning policy point of view, Flathead County typically has planned individually by subdivision. Nothing in terms of comprehensive planning, nothing in terms of long-range planning. Rather, they go through a series of current planning activities on typically a bi-weekly, which is now weekly basis, approving subdivisions. As Nick mentioned, the cumulative effect of those subdivisions can be dramatic. What did I inherit when I came up to Flathead County? First of all, is 25,000 undeveloped lots. Those lots without a building department can be built on at any given time. The number of lots, if you calculate out absorption rates, typical growth rates on an annual basis, the 25,000 lots certainly can accommodate growth in Flathead County for a long time. Now, looking at those lots, you look at, okay, what infrastructure and public services accompanies those lots. More than half of the 1,400 miles of county roads within the county are unpaved dirt or gravel. Most of those 20,000 lots are on those dirt roads. Now imagine if a quarter of those lots were built on, what it would do to an existing road system. And it's a little bit scary to us. The first week I came on board, a former planning board member came up to me and said, planning in Flathead County is 90% politics and 5% planning. But that it didn't equal 100%, didn't even faze him. He was on a roll. And I think that's a concern in the county, is planning by politics. Well, there's a role of politics, but it's not truly in planning. And we don't profess to be politicians, and obviously we don't get to vote. So, Flathead County, no long-range planning. We're trying to work our long-range planning now. We're going through a growth policy discussion. We have drafted a growth policy. That was the other thing that I inherited, was no growth policy, and having to have one by October 1st. Now, we are obviously not going to meet that deadline, but we do have a draft out. I did ask the commissioners, why didn't you tell me about all these things, and all these concerns within the county before I took the job? And they kind of looked at me and snickered and said, wow, I guess we didn't think of it. These guys are really good. So in the future, what we're looking at in the county is to support a collaborative, coordinated, and very public planning process. That's on my agenda. It's transparent. It has to be above board. We cannot be accused of being backroom deals. And so that is how we are pursuing our planning activities. And while we have all of these issues to deal with, and we will have these issues to deal with for many years, one thing that I did inherit that I'm very proud of is just an excellent planning staff. Without that planning staff, Flathead County would be back further than what it is. So in the future, we do have to dig out of the hole that the county has made in terms of not having a level of public service, not having public facilities commensurate with, if not the existing population, but a population that could move in at any given time. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tim.
And now, Tim, and Tim's, title includes the word smart growth, which I know can also elicit hisses from the audience. So maybe you can just take it away and explain why there's a reason to embrace conservation.
Okay, can everybody hear me? They gave me the microphone that I can run away from people with, so or dodge things if they're thrown. And considering I spent a lot of time, and I've actually spent a lot of time with in the halls of the legislature with seeing Colin and actually Nick, and I've never met you up there, but we've seen each other other times, and I've worked with Jeff since he's come into the state. I think one of the things that is unique about Montana right now is that there are people coming together from different sides around the table to say, how do we keep the things that we love about Montana as we grow? Yes, we'll be switching around. I could have moved over. And I'm going to try to sum up, and then I think I want to kind of ask questions back to the panel. Is we've really created a process, and I think the developers panels before really talked about how much work these guys have to go through to actually get a good development, a development that protects the environment, that protects open space, that creates livable neighborhoods, how much more work they have to go through. And they actually stole all my thunder, because what I was going to say is we have to shift the incentives in Montana, and that includes regulations. It includes adopting regulations, it includes doing good planning, and carrying out those plans and regulations, because every incentive in Montana, from the state level, the way we invest in transportation, from the way we review to protect water rights, to how we permit septic systems, to how we do to what the state laws say about planning and zoning, every incentive is for somebody to go out and do a cookie cutter development outside of town. I think Nick talked about it very well. That's the simplest thing to do, is to go outside of town, chop up land into 1 acre lots or larger, and make people who are going to buy the lots and put on a home put in the well. Because you don't have to review for cumulative impacts. It's the fastest, simplest thing to do. And we shouldn't be surprised. We've created a machine that produces this. But what does it lead us down the road to in the future? How much affordable housing is it actually building? What are we going to look like in the future? And I know Dennis Blake from the Sonoran Institute, which I have to confess, we're now part of the Sonoran Institute, but and he showed some growth projections for at least the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, those counties. We'll be showing growth projections for all 31 fastest growing counties in the western half of the state at our conference in November 14th in Helena. How was that for a plug? And we'll be talking about the implications, but really sitting down and saying, what are public benefits, and why are we not incentivizing development that provides public benefits? I would go so far as I'd like to see development become easier. I'd like to see the discussions happen where neighbors are brought together earlier in the process, where they establish very clear standards, and then if development meets that standards, it's very easy to do. It's very easy to move through. And our incentives are in the other direction now. It's site by site by site by site development review, which of course neighbors then turn out against neighbors. People are afraid of what development's going to look like, because nobody, whether it's the developer, the landowner, the neighbor, the reviewing authority, whether it's a city or a county, really knows what to expect. They don't know what can be approved. It makes the process very difficult. It makes lawyers very happy. Any lawyers in the room? Because it does lead to a very antagonistic process, and it doesn't need to be that way. Development is always difficult. Development is always contentious. because it leads to change, but it doesn't have to be the way it is now. And if we're going to create a new West together that we'll all be proud of and we'll be proud of, and it's somewhere that it retains the thing that we're all living here for, that we all come to Montana for, and that people will come to Montana for, we're going to really need to change the incentives from the state level, laws and regulations dealing with transportation, water, state planning statutes. Nick has brought up in other times that talked to him about changing the zoning statutes to actually make it easier to do zoning and implement regulations, and to make it easier to develop if it brings a true public benefit. And I would absolutely agree with Colin that affordable housing, attainable housing is truly a public benefit. Guiding growth where it can be serviced most efficiently, growth that's clustered to protect open space. I think those are truly public benefits. I'd like to see development much easier to do those and less antagonistic. So I'll stop there and kind of throw out to the group saying, what do you think we can do do you agree? And I think that people do, but what can we do as representing different groups and different stakeholders to try to move forward a better process that truly gives us public benefits and creates and we all come from that. What are those public benefits that we would like to see protected?
One of the most difficult things to do is to get the public process to work properly, where you can have a good, meaningful discussion about what you want your city, your community, your county to look like in the future. It has been done in other places in the nation. Salt Lake City did a wonderful job of envisioning, not just Salt Lake City, but all the areas around it. They have an advantage of being 80% conservative Mormons in favor of growth, so that probably helped them somewhat. But I think the biggest problem is that you have to have consensus first. Yeah, I mean, I think everybody agrees that we need affordable housing, unless you're trying to build it in their neighborhood. So we somehow have to get the public conversation going to identify the problems we have, decide what it is we want to protect, decide where it is we should have different types of building, get the planning going that direction, and get the zoning in place. One of the interesting things we discovered about 15 years ago when we looked at our present zoning is someone did a survey of what the favorite places in Missoula were. And then we looked at the zoning of those places and found out if we could rebuild it that way, if it burned down. And the answer was not only no, but hell no. They were mixed use areas like the university area, where there were single family houses. There were big single family houses, little single family houses. There were apartment buildings, there were fraternity houses, there were commercial buildings there, all in a mixture. The most popular place in the city. But you can't build that any place now with present zoning. Our zoning is stuck in the 50s and 60s with ranch-style houses on large lots, or 1 acre lots, or 5 acre lots outside of town. There has to be a change, but for there to be a change, there has to be a community agreement on what that change should be, because the politicians have to make a change. The politicians are elected, so the people have to want it first. The big question is, how do we lead that discussion? How do we get that consensus?
You know, another one of the things that I think touches on what we talked about is a lot of our regulations, and Jonathan this morning talked about our regulations being third generation, our development being fourth generation. Well, a lot of our regulations are first generation. We're looking at subdivision regulations and zoning regulations subdivision regulations were written in the 1970s that actually create and promote a sprawl pattern of development. The inability of administrators of subdivision regulations to determine whether an alley is a road or whether an alley is an alley. In terms of our zoning, instead of a representative form of government, where our elected officials determine what's best for the community or the county as a whole, basically what our zoning rules and regulations do is turn it back over to a democracy and allow the citizens to protest zoning that might be presented to us, at least on a county level, unless it's emergency zoning, and that protest overrules what the zoning might be. So let's just take a couple of things we can do right now. The first thing we can do right now is to bring our subdivision regulations up to the year 2000, up to the new millennium. Imagine all the developers that you saw today and all the development, and we said, wait, you have a constraint here. You can only get a subdivision approval for 2 years. So if you can't build it out and file all your plats in 2 years, you don't get to do a subdivision. But if we're planning, especially planning for open space, don't we want that developer to plan the whole ranch? Don't we want the developer to look at the whole ranch, set aside the open space values, right, and get the return for the lots in planning the whole thing so we can see it in one picture. Then bring the phases in through the life of the development, which could go up to 20 years. So that's the first thing. The second thing is separate the difference between subdivision regulations and zoning regulations. Minimum lot size, minimum lot widths have no place in subdivision regulations. That's zoning. And we don't need to have minimum lot sizes and minimum lot widths that create the suburban sprawl pattern, right? We need to be able to look at the developments together because, quite honestly, if you bring a project in with a number of variances, so you're not doing a suburban sprawl project, but a traditional neighborhood design or a quality infill project or a planned community, you have to request variances, right? Because you're not developing the pattern for which the regulations were designed. So those are a few suggestions on how we can move into the next level or generation. And the last one is don't just look at development costs to the developer that are forward shifted to the home buyer, right? 5 acre tracts over here and a cluster development over here, less vehicle miles traveled for service providers, less vehicle miles traveled for the person who lives there. Right? You reduce public costs for providing services. You increase the amount of open space. Right? When you allow for cluster development in your regulations and provide for reasonable zoning through a representative form of government instead of a majority vote.
Steve, do you want to say something?
So what if during a process that is public and lasts probably 2 years to get the perfect master plan and the perfect regulations and all the zoning laws just right, you get 16 years down the road and you look back and you say, how did this happen? This isn't what we had in our master plan. That's kind of what's been happening in Jackson Hole. And so outside of the formal process, some community leaders, and again, Jonathan's at the heart of this, came up with a concept of informally meeting in a concept, a group called Sustaining Jackson Hole. All community sectors are represented and participate and meet regularly. Each sector basically has an ideal statement or a vision statement, and then they measure incremental change so that you can see if you as a segment of the community and then the community as a whole are accomplishing what you would like to accomplish consistent with your long-term vision. And it doesn't work in the formal zoning master plan regulation process because we get caught up doing things project to project to project, and you don't get a sense for the incremental macro change. And so if you go online, Jonathan can help you look at Sustaining Jackson Hole, and you'll get a sense for what we're doing there.
I think you could look at the problem from a number of ways and at different scales. Looking at it from kind of a macro scale, from a systems approach scale, will enable you to better zero in at the site level. Looking at it from public transportation, from facilities and services. All of those things are needed. In Flathead County, another observation is that developers, landowners, property rights, interests, they all have expectations, and those expectations have been built on years and years of culture. And no one's going to change that, and no one's going to judge that culture. However, if we are to move into something different, and I think that's what's being suggested, that's going to require not only an education of the elected officials, staff, but also the general public, and in particular, those who work on behalf of landowners through engineering companies, surveyors, because I can tell you our surveyors like the way things are being done. And so to get them to do something different is going to require that education. And so while I think all the comments up here that I've heard are excellent, the public needs to be an active player in the education as much as elected officials and staff.
I was just going to say that one thing I find that it's interesting that particularly it seems like everyone's speaking to is the need for accountability and standards, and that's clearly something that I think that we've been hearing today about. People are hungry for a little more of that, whether it's done in the policy realm or whether it's done in kind of what Steve's talking about in community consensus way, but I think that's interesting that people see that as one of the ways to reach towards a solution. I'd love to open it up for questions and see if people have any questions they want to pose members of Dawn and members of the panel.
I'd like to ask Mr. Garrett a question.
Be nice. Just remember to be nice. Okay?
What do you think of the Montana's model of subdivision regulations, and do they come anywhere near close to what we're talking about here?
The subdivision regulations deal with process. How do you get a plat, a parcel of land, through a process to where it can be subdivided? That can be accomplished either in a very simple process or a very complex process. That process can't stand alone. It needs to be coupled with other processes in terms of creating a vision and providing the implementation tools needed to make good land use decisions. I think the subdivision law, we've just now finished redrafting the county's subdivision regulations, although we haven't truly gone public with them yet, are pretty decent. It lays out a fairly clear way to get from point A to point B, and that's to get through development. What it doesn't do is encourage creativity and innovative design. And they may not have to. You could couple other tools to get to that creativity and innovation. So I'm not sure whether it's counties and municipalities, or perhaps, and I know in our case, trying to add too much into the subdivision regulations, because let's face it, we don't have a lot of other tools to use for planning. So we'll put those standards in for minimum lot width. If you don't have zoning, where else are you going to deal with them? Well, you deal with them in the tools that you do have. But I think we ought to be looking at all of the regulations on a more comprehensive, and everybody here has heard the term Unified Development Code. But that's exactly what it is. You look at the various aspects of design, impact, and process as one system.
If I may, I'll address some of, something that I've heard today, and I hear all the time across the state, is one of the things is cities have to, especially those cities that do have zoning codes based on the 1920s and 30s U.S. Department of Commerce models, which are really restrictive, and they were designed to keep, renting plants out of residential neighborhoods. Cities' codes are often too restrictive. They don't allow flexibility. They don't allow traditional neighborhoods to be built. They make it difficult to build mixed-use buildings downtowns and in neighborhood centers. Counties, typically in Montana, have very few standards for any development, whether it's to protect open space or for infrastructure beyond just the impacts of that development itself. And so we have this, it's no surprise that development, if you look at the development over the last 20 years, has been going predominantly out of cities, because they've been put in cities, not all cities, so when the mayors get up, please don't yell at me. But cities cities have been pushing development out in some ways, and counties have been gobbling it up, but they haven't been prepared. Most of them haven't been prepared both with predictable standards, whether it's through your subdivision regulations. As Jeff said, it's the one thing that's required by counties, so the political will to actually adopt regulations, it doesn't take political will. To adopt zoning, however, is very difficult. But often, the types of standards that we need to protect our open spaces, our wildlife, to ensure that there's really adequate, sustainable infrastructure there, need to traditionally in other states go into zoning. So what we need to do is, in some ways, we need to bring cities and counties together, both plan for where we can service growth efficiently, incentivize it there, and then if with the community's input, adopt standards, and if you meet those standards, make development very simple and easy to go forward, or simpler. It's never very simple.
I think what Tim hit on was a key formula that the state legislature gave us. It's one, adopt a growth policy. Adopt one. Don't take 7 or 9 or 20 years to adopt one, but adopt a growth policy. Have a good public involvement process and adopt it. But then number 2 is implement it. Implement it. It's a word we really don't use much. We adopt a lot of growth policies, I think you'll agree, Tim, but we implement very few. And the reason we implement very few is because of the restrictions relative to the zoning laws. So when I tell you I'm in favor of zoning as a land use tool, I am because of predictability, but only when that zoning is based on a growth policy. And I think the place we fall down in Montana is we're pretty good at doing growth policies, we're very poor on implementing, very poor on implementing. So we wind up with Flathead's model of we do planning by reviewing subdivisions through a subdivision regulation. That's not planning. That's not anything.
Great. Do we have more provocative questions out there?
For Steve Jackson, how did your plan fail, and what are you doing to address this to this your more informal group? How did the planning process fail that you had? Sorry, how the planning process, you said you had a plan in place, but that really failed, and now you have a more informal group working to address unmet issues. What failed, and how are you doing things different that will make it successful?
I don't think I said it failed. It's just that when looking back, you don't think it's achieved the goals of the master plan vision. How did that happen? And so, for example, the master plan and regulations don't address the fact that we have 40%, perhaps as much as 40% Latino workforce, and perhaps 40 or 50% of the workforce in the retail and restaurants and the 5-star hotels drive 60 miles. And although we have, beautiful open space and we've accomplished a lot of the master plan goals, the community character is gone or leaving, and those types of things. So that's why I say beyond the process that provides rigorous regulatory treatment of a development application, how do you sustain the community over time? And that process, I think, is beyond the law. It takes a commitment by the community, starting with individual leaders, community elders, to begin. And one potential way to do it is the way that John structured Sustaining Jackson Hole. And you can look at it online and talk to Jonathan.
I want you to watch for a pattern. I talked to you earlier about different lot sizes and patterns, but I want you to look for a pattern in your own neighborhood. And that's a pattern of when you have regulations which create a sort of a mono pattern of lots, you create a sort of a mono pattern on a single socioeconomic characteristic. And I want you to look around in your own neighborhoods. And I want you to look for that wonderful vibrancy that I had in the neighborhood I was growing up with, and I still have in my neighborhood. It's called children. It's called children. And if we don't have affordable housing, and we don't have a mix of socioeconomic opportunities within neighborhoods, we lose the very vitality, the very heart of which is our neighborhoods. And surprisingly, it is a result of our land use policies, absolutely.
One of the things that I have heard over and over the last 2 days is cluster development. My experience is that there's no definition for it, but when you take and hire the best people that you can get to plan cluster development, say, oops, that's not it when you get into the approval process. I would like to know in other areas, what is your definition of cluster development? Do you have one?
I think everybody looked at me when you asked that question. So, well, I think it's you take 1,000 acres and you put one house up in the corner. That's a cluster. So, okay, that was the one I thought people would expect. I mean, really, what I think is more important than, my definition of cluster development is a vast majority of the land, and the most important lands are protected in perpetuity through a conservation easement, and that you're clustering houses away from the critical wildlife habitat, away from river corridors, away from those places, but you're giving people the immediate access to those. giving people the views of those, that if you chopped up that same piece of land into the cookie cutter, bring in a surveyor, chop it up into 1 acre square lots all the way across, everybody's looking at something and somebody else. So you get that benefit that all the developers earlier were talking about. They can market that open space more than having my definition, and I think that those standards need to be established very clearly in local regulations. We're saying, what do we as a community and a county want? And if it's 75% of the land needs to be protected, and if it's in platted county and they establish standards, and we get Jeff in trouble now. And they establish a cluster development standard that's 75% of the land for the whole development needs to be protected, including any frontage within 300 feet of the platted lake. That's their standard. But establish clear standards. And then if people meet it, make it easy for them to develop. I think if they go up and beyond it, great. But in those types of developments, I think you need clear standards. And there are good models out there. We just haven't seen a ton of them in Montana because, like all of us were talking about, it's easier to do something else right now.
But I guess my question was, does it exist right now? Because people who are trying to do cluster development are coming up against the fact that there's no definition, but whatever you're doing, it's not right.
No, most counties and communities, I'll stick to counties because cluster development is most appropriate, I think, in rural areas. But I would say the minors edition that Stuart Goldberg was talking about before is a good example. Very few counties have established good, clear standards for cluster development. They've established very good, clear standards for very few good, clear standards for almost any mitigating or avoiding almost any adverse impact. So because they rely upon subdivision regulations, that all they do is they create a process, like Jeff was talking about, not substantive standards.
In addition, there's always more than one factor that's being considered in the review process. So you may have a growth policy that has a definition for cluster. You may have a subdivision set of regulations, Jerry, that has a definition for cluster. But because we're in a political process, the cluster may not be what the neighbors want in terms of status quo. Right? You may find out that while you meet the definition of cluster in the subdivision regulations, and you might meet the definition in the growth policy, there may be another document out there that creates the area that you want to do the development in as preserved as open space. So there's a number of different factors beyond just the pure definition of cluster that I think go into what happens in the process. And I appreciate where you're coming from, but truthfully, we do land development in the political process.
Do we have one more smart question out there? No, I can ask something. I'd like to see if there's anything like that yet.
My question is for anyone, but I also wanted to defend Jeff Harris on the Flathead County Planning Board, in that he was handed a plate or a boat with a lot of holes in it, trying to keep it afloat. I think is an eminent job he's doing. One of the ironies of the development that I see in the West is that northern Montana, I live in Whitefish, in Flathead, is that area was developed as a result of the railroad going through. In other words, the transportation came first, then the development followed. I think that if you look back in the 50s and 60s, in this country, that a lot of that development was also, a lot of development throughout the country was a result of roads and freeways, interstates, and what have you, going out from the cities, allowing the suburbs to develop. And yet it seems like just the opposite is happening. People come in and put in a development or a subdivision, and then the road is supposed to follow. And in the Flathead, for example, where it is based on somebody puts in a subdivision, but there's no requirement to have any kind of transportation infrastructure before that project has even gone in. So what you end up with is a development of a lot of people suddenly growing in an area with no way to get from that area to any place else that they need to go. And then you have all these, and they try and start building roads. It ends up being, to me, a political process because there's no money. There's a lot of issues that you guys are talking about. I think this is a really wonderful discussion where you're trying to bring real policy to vision. But my question is, really, what is being done, both at the state level and the county level, to try and get these roads built, the transportation system infrastructure put in, prior to the actual developments?
Okay, thanks very much. By the way, that question and praise for Jeff was not a plan. Now, in the 2 minutes we have left, who would like to take that question?
I'll start, and then Nick might play cleanup, I think. Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's one of these, it's the problem of lack of planning for not just development, but the infrastructure to service it. And dealing with development site by site by site by site. And when I was talking about state incentives for cookie cutter development to go outside of town where it can locate most efficiently, be most cheaply, transportation is certainly a part of that. If you develop inside a city, or if you develop where you're required to have city standard roads, it's going to cost you more, rather than going out when your requirement is basically just putting a new light at an infrastructure, at an intersection on the state highway and in your internal road system, and especially if that only has to be at gravel standards or whatever. There have been a couple of changes recently. There was an impact fee bill that passed last legislative session that really starts to encourage local governments to get ahead of infrastructure, to start saying, where are we as local governments going to invest in it, and how much of that, how much of new infrastructure should be paid for by the development that's creating the demand. So that's a first step. But really, it gets back to, we need to plan for the infrastructure to service growth and guide growth where it can be serviced most efficiently. And if growth goes in those areas, we need to make it easier to develop in those areas where it can be serviced most efficiently. And part of that is incentives are streamlining the subdivision review, streamlining the development review, using public investments in infrastructure. But if you don't locate in those areas, there need to be standards that hold people to a sustainable level of infrastructure for road, sewer, water, fire, police, all those things. We currently don't have those beyond the site-by-site review process.
Okay, I think that's it.
I'm going to exercise producer's privilege here, and I'm going to pose a question which somebody put to me, which I think is a good one, very good one for this panel to address. So in 2 sentences maximum, I want to hear what each of you think about 154.
Can it be a run-on sentence?
No. Well, Tim, we know you don't like it, so we can move straight on to Jeff. 154 is the takings, Key Road Takings Initiative.
Kill it.
Very good.
Kill it.
Steve, you're from Wyoming, you get a pass if you want, but...
Members of our county commission are definitely opposed to the measure. While, the carrot of it is, the takings, the fiscal takings. The impact to planning across the state and the local governments, it can't even be measured at this point.
The impact can't be measured, meaning...
It would be so huge.
It would be
Do
so
you mean that it would be so large? Is that why?
Measured in terms of cost to the
Right.
counties,
Right.
to the cities.
Can I get my second sentence?
Go ahead.
There's just one. I'll
One
try to make that
sentence.
one. We're part of a society, every single one of us, whether it's a land use issue or not. And in order for us to function as a society, we have to be able to have rules and regulations that create a sense of place and quality of life. I-154 would take that away.
Tim?
And I-154 is basically about all the things that we're saying are bad about the current process. It pits development, neighbors versus neighbors. It ruins any type of planning, and this is my run-on. And frankly, it'll undermine protections for property rights and property values over time significantly, because it says your value, your ability to talk about the impacts that the development next to you is going to have is gone. I mean, it takes away those rights that people currently have.
And my just emphasis is, first of all, if you want to learn about this in how it's both playing out in Montana and across the nation, Blaine Harden, a colleague of mine, and myself, we wrote a story about this just in the last week for the Washington Post, so you can look that up. And I'd like to say that as someone who covers national politics, I only wish that our federal officials discussed contentious issues in as thoughtful a manner and civilized a manner as we had this afternoon. So thanks very much.